Bragg Financial is pleased to celebrate 10 years of support for Trail of History, serving high net worth families with portfolio management and planning advice. Bragg Financial is committed to our clients and our community. BraggFinancial.com. This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
White lightning, Mountain Dew, corn liquor, or moonshine. No matter what you call it, this crystal clear liquid flows like water through America's history.
Distilled spirits, as we know them, came with the Europeans when they came, and so this was a big part of life and culture.
While it's a big part of the culture, the nation's relationship with alcohol is a little complicated. A common source of income for farmers, liquor production was once as common on an American farm as apple pie, until Uncle Sam wanted his slice.
In the strict sense of the word, it's not moonshine until it's illegal.
In North Carolina, Wilkes County garnered quite the reputation for making moonshine.
It was around the 50s that we got dubbed the moonshine capital. I think at that time we were generating somewhere from like $2 to $3 million in revenue of the illegal moonshine trade.
Here in the county, it isn't hard to find someone with a moonshine story.
When I asked my dad what that hole was, and he said that's where your grandpa had an illegal still.
Today, however, there's new opportunities to cash in by making spirits in North Carolina. Legally, of course.
It's, my grandpa's recipes. It's nothing really new learning. It's just, doing it on a bigger scale.
Coming up, meet the folks at Call Family Distillery, taking more than a century of family knowledge of distilling and building out a successful moonshine business. Then deep dive into America's sometimes tumultuous relationship with alcohol and see how prohibition and taxation resulted in the creation of stock car racing. And meet a Hickory bar owner who's sharing his passion for fine whiskey. All that and more on this episode of Trail of History. Downtown Wilkesboro, tucked away in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the town draws you in with its historic charm, murals, and classic Main Street buildings. But at one time, Wilkesboro, and all of Wilkes County for that matter, were known for something else.
This is the moonshine capital of the world in a certain time period.
Just a few miles from downtown.
Over here in the stainless barrel, you see the mash of fermentation.
What Brian Call and his son Austin are doing today is perfectly legal.
This process, it starts out real sweet when we cook the cornmeal and grain in, and towards the end of fermentation, it ends up kind of a sour taste to it. All that activity is when you pitch the yeast, that's the yeast eating up the sugar molecules and converting it into alcohol.
They're following an age-old family recipe.
I always ask Dad why we do sour mash whiskey, and he said, well, that's the way we've been doing it for generations. And the basic for moonshine, like my dad and Grandpa, number one, they wanted to get the most yield out of their product, so they'd use sugar, cornmeal, yeast, wheat, or rye, whichever one they could get their hands on at the time. And 3 to 4 days fermenting in your fermentation tanks. Then you'll pump it over in the still. Around 172 degrees, your alcohol vapors start coming off. Ours is kind of unique. We got a thumper, then a homemade condenser.
Once condensed, and depending on the mash recipe, the flowing crystal clear alcohol ends up as moonshine or whiskey.
Every still is different, but our still, in about 2 hours, we can make around 180 gallons of whiskey or moonshine. You gotta have all grain to make whiskey. You can't use no sugar in it, and it's gotta be barrel aged. Going back to moonshine, you can run the moonshine, you can put fruit in it like this, make apple pie, or sell it clear. You don't have to age it or nothing.
Everything at the distillery centers around family.
My son will be 8 generations. Kind of started with a Lutheran minister over in Tennessee, and he ended up having a legal distillery. It's called the Daniel and Call Distillery, District 4, Number 7. He is a Lutheran minister, and the temperance movement come through, and there's a lady, Angelica, the story goes, preaching at his church, and she looked right at him and said, you're gonna go to hell if you keep making this whiskey. So he ended up selling out to Jack Daniels and choosing the Lord's work, and some of the family members kept on in the whiskey business. On the illegal side, here we are today in full circle making legal moonshine and whiskey again.
During the era of Prohibition, a few members of the Call family found themselves on the other side of the law.
Grandpa, he was in the liquor business in a big way. Him and Junior Johnson's dad, you know, they made shine together, and Grandpa ended up going to prison.
With his grandfather away in prison, Brian's father Clay stepped up at a young age to help provide for the family.
His uncle Howard was hauling whiskey, and he started riding with him, helping him unload the product around 13-year-old. And the story goes, my dad, he started hauling around 14 and 15-year-old.
Their products pay homage to the previous generations of distillers in the Call family, starting with the Uncatchable, a well-earned nickname given by some in law enforcement to Brian's late father, Clay.
That's our 101 clear moonshine. And that's the proof that my dad, all the moonshiners kept it around 100 proof. That's the original recipe.
Then there's the whiskey named for the Reverend Daniel Call.
The Reverend Daniel Call. This is a 4-year-old whiskey we done. It's aged in new white oak barrels, and we filter it through sugar maple.
The 7th and 8th generation distillers, the Calls, along with their ancestors, are intertwined in America's long tradition of making distilled spirits.
People like the Germans and the Scot and Irish settlers that came over, whiskey making was already a big part of their culture before they immigrated.
It was a priest in Jamestown that discovered that you could distill corn, and so that became kind of a natural thing, you know, although there are all kinds of things distilled. Peaches and apples and plums, and if you could get it to ferment, you know, they were going to distill it. The main was corn liquor, and so that was, you know, what most farmers were making. There was even an exchange rate in most stores for a gallon of liquor is worth this much. It was a pretty stable thing.
In 1791, and saddled with Revolutionary War debt, President George Washington and Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton looked for a revenue stream to pay off the war. Their solution? A tax on domestically produced distilled spirits. As you might imagine, in a nation famous for the Boston Tea Party, this new tax didn't go over so well. In 1794, a group in Pennsylvania fought back, literally, resulting in an armed conflict called the Whiskey Rebellion. The whiskey tax only lasted about a decade, thanks to the nation's third president.
One of Jefferson's chief planks in his campaign was the repeal of the excise tax on liquor, which happened. And so from Jefferson up to the Civil War, it's perfectly legal. In 1862, Congress passes a bill in the midst of the Civil War to raise revenue for the war effort, and they put an excise tax on liquor, you know, as kind of a wartime measure. You know, well, that excise tax has never gone away. It's still there.
With the federal tax on distilled spirits firmly in place, America's relationship with them starts to get a little interesting.
In the strict sense of the word, it's not moonshine until it's illegal. Prior to the Civil War, it's perfectly legal. And it took a few years. The federal government didn't want to push things too far because of fears of relaunching hostilities, but they began enforcing in the late 1860s.
History professor and author of the book Tar Heel Lightnin', Daniel Pierce says once North Carolina was a major liquor producer and after the Civil War, legal production continued as long as the tax was paid. But the post-war economy in the state was struggling. The added federal tax created a financial hardship on many small farmers who relied on whiskey production to make ends meet. The whiskey tax turned them into well-meaning outlaws.
I'm going to pay the tax. That's not really feasible because it's just going to wipe out anything I can make off of this, and I need the money, particularly after the war.
In a classic case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, struggling farmers often made moonshine just to make enough money to pay the property tax on their farms.
North Carolina is a long economic recovery from the Civil War, and even, you know, when you get into the agriculture, just the profits from agriculture were just going down. People who didn't want to go into mills and and didn't want to move north or, wanted to stay on their land, pay their taxes. I mean, one of the big ironies is that what a lot of people were doing was evading a tax so that they could pay a tax.
But the law was the law.
The federal government tried really hard to crack down on the illegal production. If you're a relatively small producer, for the most part, you could probably get away with it. But the government, particularly in the 1870s, they really began cracking down, and they were launched what were known as the Moonshine Wars during this, where you had a good bit of violence. But by and large, what they did was just drive it all underground. People didn't quit making it.
Taxation, however, wasn't the only threat to producers and the consumers. By the end of the 19th century, the temperance movement was gaining ground.
There are a lot of other factors that are going on here. And a big factor is the fact that particularly evangelical groups, particularly Baptists and Methodists, latched onto this growing national movement towards temperance, which is not prohibition, but it's we want to eliminate saloons, we want to eliminate drunkenness, we want to eliminate, and they tied a lot of it to like child abuse and spousal abuse and stuff like this.
Advocates for the temperance movement found allies in both business and political circles around North Carolina.
This is the period when the textile mills are growing. Textile mill owners did not want their workers drinking, and so a lot of them very much jumped into this movement and pushed it.
On the political side,
there is a definite racial component. In North Carolina in the 1890s, the Democratic Party, they had lost their majorities in the legislature. They had lost the governorship to the Republicans and the populists who had joined together. And so they were looking for how to get back in power, and so they launched a huge white supremacy campaign in 1898.
The Democrats' campaign worked, but to stay in power, they would need support from temperance supporters.
So the Democratic Party was very sensitive to any sort of threat to their power. Well, as the temperance movement grew, they began putting more and more pressure on the Democratic Party to join in, and they threatened to launch a third party. But I think a lot of elite people knew that they could vote for prohibition. This would keep alcohol out of the hands of African Americans. It would keep it out of the hands of poor people. It would keep it out of the hands of mill workers, people that they did not want drinking, but they were going to find a way to get it.
So in 1908,
the referendum passes in 1908 overwhelmingly in North Carolina. And in fact, North Carolina, it's not the first state to have prohibition, statewide prohibition, but it is the first to do so by referendum.
And in 1909,
January 1st, 1909, North Carolina becomes a dry state. So this is 11 years before national prohibition. It's like North Carolina is saved, and it's this glorious day, and we're just going to go on to greater and greater things because we have now, ended the threat and the evil of alcohol. It was the language of prohibition was so far over the top. I mean, it's just like every evil in the world was associated with alcohol.
At the federal level, it was the start of the Roaring '20s when the 18th Amendment went into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. Nationwide, liquor and beer flowed into the streets as law enforcement destroyed inventories. Supporters of the North Carolina law and the 18th Amendment saw it as a moral victory. But Pierce says,
the people who really won the lottery when Prohibition hit were the moonshiners. Because what Prohibition did was just to eliminate any legal production in North Carolina. So now they had a monopoly on the market. You could only get it from someone who was producing it illegally. The illegal manufacturing becomes much larger scale. They're using bigger stills. They change the basic recipe, which was pretty simple. One of the things that was really interesting is really looking at how much of a role women played in this business, and particularly in that whole issue of the speakeasies, of the liquor houses, particularly if they were widows or women whose husbands had abandoned them, they had small children. It was kind of the social welfare system.
Nationally, Prohibition was a failure. Crime rates soared, and the federal government lost millions in tax revenue. In December of 1933, the ratification of the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment, once again making alcohol legal. But here in North Carolina and places like Wilkes County, not much changed.
It's a very long, slow death in North Carolina. When national prohibition ends, North Carolina continues with local option. And so most of the state remained dry. You know, they did put the ABC system in place, but most of North Carolina remained dry at some level or another.
For the residents of Wilkes County, coming out of both Prohibition and the Depression, making moonshine meant survival.
Like the rural Appalachian, like live off the land type of culture here. There's the stereotype of like the bummy moonshiner bootlegger guy, and he's dumb and wears his overalls and he just wants to be a vagabond or something just for the sake of it. But really it was just a way for people to make ends meet. You know, you could make a whole lot more money for your family turning your corn crop into liquor than you could just going and selling it at the market.
And moonshiners weren't the only ones benefiting from illegal moonshine.
There are all kinds of other people that are attached, the store owners and, you know, communities just become enmeshed in this. One of the things I talked about in my book was the connection between particularly rural churches and moonshiners, and there are all kinds of accounts of people donating the proceeds from their liquor making to build a church or to paint the church or to pay the pastor or whatever. You know, so pastors kind of, you know, had to walk a fine line there, you know, with this, you know, particularly in rural areas. In the towns, they're all in on prohibition, but in rural areas, they're a little, you know, they had to watch themselves.
Back in downtown Wilkesboro, the old Wilkes County Courthouse, the same courthouse many moonshiners faced judgment, now houses the Wilkes Heritage Museum. Eden Hamby with the museum says by the 1950s, Wilkes County had earned a reputation.
It was around the 50s that we got dubbed the moonshine capital. I think at that time we were generating somewhere from like $2 to $3 million in revenue of the illegal moonshine trade. Pretty much everywhere. It was going around the communities. It was, you know, traveling from holler to holler. It was going to like New York, Chicago, Atlanta, all those types of places.
The Wilkes Heritage Museum contains several exhibits related to the county's moonshining legacy. At the Call Family Distillery, the family displays their vast collection of artifacts as well. Brian Call says avoiding the law required creativity and stealth.
My grandpa era, they'd take like a mule and these wooden sleds and haul supplies back in the woods. And then when they'd haul them out, they had these big cans, these wooden jacketed cans you see behind me here, there on the floor, and they was metal, so these guys, they made a lot of noise, so they put wood around them, you know, where the mule was hauling them back out, it wouldn't make no racket. My dad used to tell me stories that if you had to steal up a month, you was doing good back in them days, because, you know, this moonshine capital of the world, they had 30 or 40 agents out here looking for, you know, you had to take a lot of water to make moonshine, and they get out and walk these creeks and stuff.
Of course, not everyone in Wilkes County made illegal liquor.
My dad used to bust the stills up pretty good. He was in sheriff's department in the 50s with Fred Myers, a bunch of those guys. And he tore them up, blew them up, dynamite and stuff. And he was in law enforcement, but mostly all his life. I was a little kid at home, and here comes a lowboy trailer to the house. It has a complete still on it. The boxes were still hot. And I said, Dad, didn't y'all blow this one up? No, he said, we're taking this somewhere. I know where it went. Went in a chicken house somewhere.
Brian Call's longtime friend, Keith Huffman, says in the small community, local law enforcement and the moonshiners never really had any ill will towards each other. They just each had a job to do.
Going back to Dad and Junior, you know, Dad was on the law enforcement side, Junior was on the river, you know, the liquor making side, and, you know, they were still friends.
Now for the more romanticized part of illegal moonshine, the cars, built for speed, like this black '66 Dodge Coronet. Brian's late father once used it for transporting his valuable but illegal cargo. But Brian says his father's favorite car,
So the 61 New Yorker was his favorite car. It's baby blue, looks more like a business coupe, but my dad, he'd put a sports coat on and a Stetson hat, and they thought he was somebody of importance like a judge or lawyer, but he'd have a trunk load of hooch in the back.
son Brian says his dad's main rule when hauling moonshine,
He wouldn't ever run on a Friday or Saturday night because there's a lot of people on the road for the weekends. He'd start hauling on a Sunday night, and he'd haul to Wednesday or Thursday. But for the weekends, he was always worried, running fast like that, they might run over somebody.
with so many souped-up cars running around, it was inevitable. Bravado would kick in.
When they weren't racing the police, a lot of times, how men are, they want to prove that theirs is the fastest or whatever, so they would race each other. And then that slowly got more organized until they founded NASCAR.
Clay Call was a lifelong friend of racing legend Junior Johnson.
Him and Junior Johnson become best friends of hauling shine, and I always asked Dad, I said, why in the hell didn't you ever get into racing? He said there wasn't no money in it. He stuck to the moonshine business, and Junior went on racing.
Over in Hickory,
All right, man, I got a couple things for you to try today.
at the Hickory Social House Bootleggers Whiskey Bar, owner Matt Mill and distributor rep Greg Blackburn are sampling some of the newer whiskeys.
These are from Aristotle Spirits, which is in Garner, North Carolina.
The barrel-aged distilled spirits' popularity is seeing renewed interest.
Whiskey across the nation. We really see whiskey everywhere, and in North Carolina, we've had a huge boom here lately of whiskey buyers and whiskey groups and all these people who are seeking out the different bottles that exist. Very much a collector's thing. There are people who have multiple bottles in their collection, of all kinds of different things. I myself have a pretty extensive collection and just enjoy the camaraderie that comes with it. Just being able to get with other people that enjoy the same hobby and try different bottles, exchange things, and just share with each other.
Miller enjoys sharing his love for the caramel-colored beverage.
It's a lot of different things. I think there's the parallel with, people enjoying a pipe or a cigar, that complex flavor, something to sip on that's not just drinking for the sake of the alcohol, but drinking for the sake of the flavor. I'll pick out what I want to drink. I'll just go, what flavor profile am I looking for in a whiskey today? Do I want something light? Do I want something heavy? Do I want something spicy? Do I want something mellow?
The collection at his whiskey bar has something for just about every taste.
Over the years, collected quite a bit. I think we're right about 200 different whiskeys and moonshines today. Always looking for the unicorn to add to the collection and sell to the public. So it's a fun hobby.
Over 100 years ago, legal distilleries were prevalent across North Carolina, but prohibition laws killed most of them off. And because of the aging process, making whiskey requires a sizable investment of time and money.
That's why so few distilleries are doing it.
But slowly, North Carolina-made products are on the rise.
So North Carolina's catching up, and that's been really exciting. I'm excited, for the future of it. I know we have a lot of beer tourism, especially up in the Asheville area. The breweries. I think the micro distilleries are going to continue to grow. It's just common sense, really economically, to support local. The money stays in the community. It reinvigorates the community. And then you get to have your little hometown heroes.
Back in Wilkesboro, making sure the Call family distillery catches this new wave of interest in both moonshine and whiskey means a lot of work. But Austin Call sees it as opportunity.
There's more to it than meets the eye. Learning how to the distribution part of it and pushing liquor, learning the alcohol industry in itself, it's a lot to take in. All it is telling a story, and I feel like that's what marketing pretty much is pushing a product, pushing an idea, pushing history. It's easy for me to, explain to people. Like, I'll be giving tours and stuff, and they'll ask me a bunch of questions, and I know all the answers to them because I've been in this my whole life.
The distillery started production in 2014. Brian says running it is all hands on deck.
We had a saying, one call does it all, but I figured, my wife, she takes care of the taxes, and Austin does social media, and I do most of the distilling, and we just all work as a team.
Besides their signature products, the Call family distillery continues to evolve, including the addition of a restaurant and an outdoor stage.
I was laying in bed one night, and me and my wife was trying to figure out an angle to get people to the distillery. We thought about music, so made the Mash House stage, and we bring in big acts like Muscadine Bloodline's been here, Iron Tippin', Little Texas, just a lot of national acts, and it's just made a big boom in our business, getting the name out.
For the family, the pride in what they've built is as clear as their moonshine.
I'm just proud to be, a part of this and a part of this family, and the history that we have when it comes to making moonshine and whiskey and everything else.
It's exciting just to be able to work side by side with your son. Some days are rough, working with family, but we have our little differences. We always make sure everything's good when we leave here. I just want to get it built up enough where Austin can take over and keep the tradition rolling.
When I come in here, I'm doing 5 jobs at once. So it's a learning experience all around when it comes to that, but when it comes to distilling and stuff, this is something I've always done. This is something that's been bred into me for the most part, and I have a good time doing it.
It means the world to me just keeping the heritage alive here in Wilkes County, because, the revenuers dubbed this as the moonshine capital of the world in a certain time period, and my grandpa and dad and everybody involved in the business is just thankful that I can carry on the tradition a legal way and don't have to be looking over my shoulder and worried about going to prison.
All around the world, you'll find distilled spirits, everything from Irish whiskey, Kentucky bourbon, Mexican tequila, or Wilkes County moonshine, each unique in flavor and cultural identity. Today, the Call family plays an important part in reviving the state's once vibrant distilling industry by embracing their family's moonshine heritage. Over in Catawba County, the Hickory Social House and Bootleggers Whiskey Bar do their part by providing a venue to showcase North Carolina-made whiskey and moonshine. The Old North State has an undeniable cultural, economic, and political connection to distilling. Thank you for watching this episode of Trail of History.
Production of PBS Charlotte.